Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Strength and Hormones podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Papanos. Today is another LOdown with Lo episode, which is a solo episode with me where we will be talking about how to understand your thyroid labs. This really should serve as a guide to understanding the nuances of thyroid labs because I think there is just so much confusion around thyroid panels. They can be really confusing because some of it, which we'll talk about in a minute, is kind of the opposite in terms of the way that you read it, the number you see, and what we actually medically are thinking of is happening within the body. So we'll talk about what those values are that we're aiming for. We'll talk about some of the history of thyroid lab testing. We'll talk about some of the root cause testing that we recommend if you are experiencing abnormalities within your thyroid. And then we'll also talk about just some of the variables that go into impacting these thyroid hormone levels. So let's get into today's episode. I wanted to first and foremost just start with the history of thyroid hormone testing because I think it's really important to understand that thyroid hormone testing hasn't always been a thing. It actually wasn't something that was clinically utilized until the 1970s, which in the grand scheme of things feels like maybe very long ago, but it really is not that long ago when we're thinking about how long in comparison to how long some other medical types of testing have been around. And although some of the research was starting to be done in the 1960s, and that's when clinical diagnosis was starting to happen, it wasn't really until the 1970s that there was reference ranges and that there was a thyroid panel that was established. And then in the 1970s came along something that was called the Wickham Study. And in this study, they basically concluded that thyroid stimulating hormone, which is one of the really important measures we'll talk about here, that's often what's screened for determining if there's a thyroid issue going on. In this study, they found that concentrations really above 2 are associated with an increased risk of hypothyroidism, and then about half of the population, both men and women, fall into this category. And if you know anything about thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH, the reference range for TSH goes up to about 4.5 on most labs, and generally you won't be flagged until you're above 4.5 consistently. So this study in the 1970s kind of came out and said, yeah, that's what we've said. We've said that 4.5 is that safe end of the reference range, but we're actually seeing that anything above 2, you have an increased risk of hypothyroidism. And that's why people that are functional, like myself, we like to keep TSH between 0.5 and 2. Sometimes up to 2.5 is kind of on the safe end, but really somewhere between 0.5 and 2 is really our reference range that we're looking for, even though the lab will tell you that anywhere up to 4.5 is the safe end of the range. And the reason why we use that secret menu of 0.5 to 2 is because of the findings of that Wickham study that showed that really anything above 2, you are at increased risk for hypothyroidism. And we want to start asking some questions. We want to gather a little bit more data to understand what else is going on downstream. So let's chat about what TSH is and how this all comes about. TSH is actually not a thyroid hormone. You might have heard me say this before. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. It is a hormone, but it's a hormone that is actually released from our pituitary gland, which is in our brain. And that TSH is what actually sends a signal to our thyroid to then make thyroid hormones. So how it works, if we go all the way up to the brain, is in the brain, we have something that's called our hypothalamus. If you go back to our very first podcast episode on strength and hormones, that was on the hypothalamus because it is such the core component to understanding the way that your hormones work. But in the hypothalamus, there is a hormone released called thyroid releasing hormone. And this hormone then signals down to the pituitary, which is another region in the brain, to release thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. And TSH then goes on to stimulate the thyroid. That's why it's called thyroid stimulating hormone. And the thyroid then releases T4, T3, and reverse T3. Okay. So when you go get TSH tested, when you get your labs done and you just get TSH back, that doesn't actually tell us the level of thyroid hormones. It just tells us what's probably happening with your thyroid hormones, right? Because it's going to then stimulate to the thyroid to make those hormones. But we really want to see what is happening a step further, which is what's happening with your T4 and your T3 levels, especially being that we work on a preventative mechanism at functional fueling, and that we're dietitians by trade, we want to see free T3 because free T3 is the active thyroid hormone that's going to most impact your symptoms that you experience every day. And it's going to be most impacted by dietary measures. So we're going to see the most intervention from the way that we shift dietary intake reflected in that free T3. And then we're going to see things kind of move upstream from there. So you've got TSH that makes T4 and the thyroid. T4 is the inactive form of our thyroid hormones. So that's not really what we care about. And sometimes when you get thyroid panels done, they will test T4, but they don't test T3. T3 is what we actually care about because that's the active thyroid hormone. And when you get this testing done, you can both test for total level of these hormone levels as well as free levels of the hormone levels. And what we really care about is the free levels, because there's something that are called binding proteins that happen with any of our hormones. And these binding proteins actually can impact the amount of usable hormone. So even if you have a lot of T4 or T3, doesn't really mean anything in terms of how your body's utilizing those hormones, because you could have a lot of binding proteins that are actually like sponging away some of those free available hormones for your cells of the body to utilize. And this can happen a lot with if you're on an oral contraceptive or birth control. We know that that is one of the ways that birth control impacts the hormones is by increasing thyroid binding proteins. We also know that when women are in a higher estrogen state, so when you have higher estrogen levels, that this can also increase binding proteins. And so that's why it's helpful to see total hormone levels as well, but why we really care about free thyroid hormone levels, because depending on your circumstances, you could be having these free thyroid hormone levels influenced by those binding proteins. Now, once that T4 is made, so that's like the first step in the thyroid, right? That inactive thyroid hormone T4 is made. T4 can take two routes. It can either go down to T3, or it can go down to something called reverse T3. And a little bit of it's going to always go down to both of them. But what can happen, and what happens in a lot of individuals, is that they've got too much of that T4 going down to reverse T3. And if you've ever worked with a functional provider in the past, or you've had a full thyroid panel done, then you might have noticed that your free T3 level is low, and maybe you've been told that your reverse T3 level is elevated. And this is a very common trend that can occur. It's often referred to as Euthyroid 6 syndrome, which is when you have a high or normal TSH, but your T3 levels are low and your reverse T3 is elevated. That's what it's referred to as. But we see it in a lot of other situations other than people just being sick. It's also thought that it may not be very accurate to test for reverse T3 if you are chronically ill, or if you have had any acute injury. So we don't recommend testing for this when you are like in the hospital, or if you've just had a major surgery, or if you've had you've had a car accident or something of that sort that's happened, because this is a protective mechanism that is going to be increased because of the stress of that injury or the stress of the illness. So we really want to be only testing for these things outside of more of these acute issues. And then we also, if we are going to be testing and you do have a chronic illness, we want to be thinking about how that chronic illness could be factoring into these thyroid hormone results. So that's why context is really important here, right? Because your individual situation may influence if we even do a full thyroid panel, or how we read the thyroid hormone panel. I think it's still valuable to get a thyroid panel, especially if you're having thyroid specific symptoms in those situations. But it might dictate how things are being read based off of that. Okay. So as I mentioned, you got T4, and then that goes on to make either T3, reverse T3. And we really want most of that T4 to be converted over to free T3. We don't want too much of it converted over to reverse T3, because when it gets converted to reverse T3, it actually deactivates. And so we lose all of the beneficial properties of that free T3. And that free T3 is what is the active thyroid hormone. So it's what's actually impacting our cellular function. It's what's going to regulate the speed of things like digestion and hair and nail growth and fertility fertility and your menstrual cycle and your metabolism, how you burn food for energy, that free T3 is really what is regulating that process. So we really want most of that T4 to be converting over to T3. But most of this process doesn't even happen in the thyroid. It happens in our liver and it happens in our gut. About 70% of your T4 gets converted to T3 in your liver, and about 20% gets converted in the gut. That only leaves about 10% that's happening in the thyroid. So that's where sometimes doing additional testing that can help us understand what could be driving this in the liver and in the gut, or what's going on in those areas, can actually tell us more about how to fix the problem, especially if we're seeing that you have maybe normal T4 levels, but you've got low free T3 levels. Then we might speculate that there might be some issues with that conversion happening in the liver or the gut. Okay. Ideally, we want T4 to be above 1, and we want free T3, in particular, to be above 3. So we really want to see these on the higher end of the reference range. If your T4 is below 1 and your T3 is below 3, there's definitely some issues going on. If your T4 is normal, but your free T3 is low, then there's still some issues that we need to explore there. So T4 ideally above 1 and free T3 above 3. And then with that, we want to see reverse T3 below 15. So we're testing for all of these things to see where's the bottleneck happening. Are all of these hormone levels out of range? Is it just one? What's causing it? Where is this coming from? How do we influence it? Because once we understand where your starting point is, and then we can unpack a little bit more information about where to then look for the issue, then we know how to fix it and how to get more of this free T3 happening so that we can start to see improvements to things like your metabolism and your hormone function and your gut and your brain function and all these processes that the thyroid regulates. There's also thyroid antibodies. And most of the time, you might have heard of anti-TPO, thyroid peroxidase, being tested. I would say that's probably the most common. And that's because it can both screen for Graves' disease, which is autoimmune hyperthyroidism, but it can also screen for autoimmune hypothyroidism, which is Hashimoto's. However, it is really important to look at all of the thyroid antibodies, to not just test for TPO, but to also test for anti-TG, as well as potentially thyrotropin receptor AB. Anti-TG is more specific to Hashimoto's, and thyrotropin receptor AB is more specific to Graves' disease. And a lot of times those don't get tested, only anti-TPO gets tested. And sometimes these autoimmune thyroid conditions fly by under the radar because of that. So that's why if we suspect that there's issues with autoimmunity that's causing the low thyroid hormone levels, we might want to look to see if there's other thyroid antibodies that are causing this. So the way that thyroid autoimmunity works is a little bit different than just low thyroid hormone levels, right? With thyroid autoimmunity, what's happening is that the immune system is essentially attacking the thyroid hormones and destroying them. So when you make thyroid hormones, we use TPO, we use thyroid peroxidase to be able to make T4 and T3. But when there's elevated amounts of anti-TPO, that process essentially is being like blocked, right? So that TPO is being blocked and the T4 and T3 then are getting destroyed. And so it's actually the immune system that is attacking those thyroid hormones and that's causing those thyroid hormones to be low. Now, sometimes at the beginning stages of things like Hashimoto's or Graves' disease, you might have antibodies, but your thyroid hormone levels aren't being affected yet. That is possible. Generally, the longer that the autoimmunity continues to go on, you'll start to see your thyroid hormone levels being impacted because these thyroid hormones are being slowly destroyed, right? But you could also have a situation, which we see sometimes, where you might have borderline antibody levels. So you might just be like right above the reference range or right below the reference range. And the immune system is kind of showing that there's some issues going on. And we can suppress the immune system. We can treat the root causes that are driving that to be able to prevent things from escalating further. So that is something that can also happen, but there are kind of two different situations we're looking at, right? Are the thyroid hormone levels low because of the autoimmunity causing it, or the thyroid hormones levels low because it's a downstream effect from the brain going down to the thyroid. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there's something called Euthyroid 6 syndrome. Generally, that happens when you have a normal TSH, but your T3 levels are low and your reverse T3 is elevated. This trend, though, can also happen in individuals that are underfueling. So, when I began my career, I was working in athletics and I was doing nutrition research in athletic populations, and we were testing, we were looking at things like relative energy deficiency in sport, and as well as female athlete triad. You might be familiar with these. Generally with these, they can happen in both men and women, but it's where the reproductive system essentially shuts off, and women aren't having a period, men have very low testosterone levels, and oftentimes there's also other hormones that are impacted in this process, like thyroid hormones and such. And so what we saw in those individuals that had very low hormone outputs was that they generally also had very low free T3 levels and elevated reverse T3 levels. But their TSH levels were normal. And so when that happens, when we see that trend, we can conclude that it's a nutritional deficiency, because essentially what's happening is the body is in extremely stressed state. The body is conserving energy. The thyroid essentially is what sets the metabolic rate. And so when these thyroid hormone levels, like your T3, drop, it's a way of our body protecting us. And so if we see that your TSH is normal, but the free T3 and your reverse T3 are out of range, your free T3 is low, your reverse T3 is high, we know that the body is probably not either getting in enough total energy, enough total calories, or you're expending more energy that you are intaking. So there's a deficit of energy available for the reproductive system and the hormone system, right? Your endocrine system. It could also be nutritional deficiency, not just calories, but potentially macronutrients, in particular carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are really important for converting T4 over to T3. It could also be mineral deficiencies. As I mentioned earlier, the thyroid is very mineral dependent, and we know that deficiencies in things like magnesium, selenium, zinc directly impact your ability to convert T4 over to T3. And if you're not eating enough, you're probably not getting in enough nutrients, right? Or if you've got gut issues, you might be not absorbing the nutrients you're eating. Or if you just aren't eating enough of these nutrients, or your soil's super depleted, like it is for a lot of us, then you might just be deficient in a lot of these. Even myself, I eat a very good diet, and when I do my testing a lot, I come back with nutritional deficiencies, and I vary the foods I eat, and I take my vitamins and all the things. But it's very common to have nutritional deficiencies. I really don't believe that diet can always be 100% adequate, especially if you're living a high stress life where your body is using more of these minerals and nutrients every single day, right? You have to remember that the more that we ask our body to do, the more nutrients our body needs to do that. It's just like if you try to build a bigger house, you need more bricks, you need more materials to do that. So we can't expect that we're asking so much of our body and we're not giving it more nutrients to be able to fuel that process. So as I mentioned, this can both happen in what's called Euthyroid 6 syndrome. It can also happen in situations of underfueling, whether that is not enough energy overall for the reproductive system and hormone system, not enough carbohydrate, and not enough minerals. There's also something called subclinical hypothyroidism, and this could be where your TSH is borderline. So you might be, creeping up to that 4.5 or right above it range, but your T4 and your T3 are normal. And this is a little bit of a different type of treatment. Generally, when we see an elevated TSH, we want to think what's going on within the nervous system. And we've talked a lot about the nervous system in our last couple of episodes where we talked about HRV and acupuncture and how they work on the nervous system. But the nervous system really is a indicator of our body's resiliency to stress and how we are navigating between that parasympathetic and that sympathetic mode, right? And so if our body is chronically in this fight or flight, that sympathetic drive, then that's going to drive more stimulation from the brain down to the thyroid. So we want to go back to the brain in this situation, right? If we're seeing a high TSH, remember that's a brain hormone. So we got to go back and think what's going on within the nervous system that's causing this TSH to be elevated. There's also some minerals that can cause this. For example, we know like iron deficiency can also cause an elevated TSH. So again, going back to the role of minerals, iron is a mineral. We want to make sure that we've ruled out that there isn't potential iron deficiency, because that is something that is very common in women as well. Now, T3, as I mentioned, is that active thyroid hormone, and it really works to control all speed in the body. In particular, it controls our metabolic rate. It really sets the speed as to how our metabolism and our metabolic system works. And metabolism doesn't just mean calories or like our weight, right? I know that's a very simple way to think about it. And a lot of times it's how we think about it. But there's a lot of other things that metabolism controls. Metabolism even controls the cell growth, right? So we're learning more and more every day, for example, how diseases like cancer are actually a metabolic disease. And that's because our metabolism also regulates the speed of cell growth in the body. And so T3 is actually what controls our metabolic rate and our metabolism. And it does this through these little things called our mitochondria that you've probably heard of that are within our cells. And these mitochondria are really important because these mitochondria play a role in everything from the energy levels that we feel every day to even things like chronic fatigue syndrome and migraines and fertility. We know that each of those situations I just mentioned, plus so many more, that mitochondrial function or mitochondrial dysfunction, which is essentially where mitochondrial function isn't working optimally, are implicated in each of those situations. So, a lot of times the thyroid is part of this process because the thyroid is what is controlling and regulating how our mitochondria are functioning. TSH is that thyroid stimulating hormone. It's also important to note that it is positively correlated with cortisol, inflammation, which is typically tested through something called C-reactive protein, and the hunger hormone leptin. Okay, so these are other labs that we can look at alongside of your thyroid. But what that means is that if you have a higher level of cortisol, remember that means you're more in that sympathetic nervous system, then you are more prone to a higher TSH, a higher thyroid stimulating hormone. When we have higher inflammation levels, a higher CRP, that's one of the ways we can test for inflammation in the body. There's other sources of inflammation, but CRP is a marker of inflammation. CRP, when it's elevated, can also drive a higher TSH. And it can also cause us to decrease the amount of T4 that we're able to convert over to T3. And that's one of the reasons why I created our program Inflammation Harmony, is for individuals that may be experiencing the issue of low free T3 or high TSH, whether that's because of Hashimoto's or because of subclinical hypothyroidism or Euthyroid 6 syndrome. Whatever the reason is, inflammation has to be addressed because inflammation is going to both increase TSH and it's also going to lower the amount of thyroid hormones that are being converted. And also leptin. Leptin is an energy storage hormone. And so our body, it generally is going to notice issues with leptin when we are in a more energy deprived state. So one of the things that we know about, like if you're in a caloric deficit, so if you're under eating, you're not eating enough energy, that will cause leptin levels to drop. And that when our leptin levels are low, that is correlated with a higher TSH level. So this is what I was mentioning at the beginning, is that it can be a little bit confusing for individuals because the higher your TSH is means the more stimulation is coming from your brain down to the thyroid. So the easiest way to think about it is the higher the TSH, the slower your thyroid function, generally speaking. The lower the TSH, the faster your thyroid function. Okay. Because remember, TSH is stimulating down to the thyroid. So if TSH is higher, that means more stimulation is happening. And this is a negative feedback loop. So essentially what's happening is your body's saying, hey, we don't have enough thyroid hormones, enough free T3 here to do all these processes. And so it sends a message back to your brain, and your brain sends more of that stimulating hormone, TSH, down to your thyroid to get your thyroid to make more of those thyroid hormones. And that's why when your TSH is high, it generally goes along with a lower free T3 level. Okay. So it's all a negative feedback loop. All of our endocrine system really is a negative feedback loop, where essentially it's like your body's saying, you're looking at the ovaries, we're looking at the thyroid, we're saying, okay, what are the hormone levels? Sends a message back to the brain. That hypothalamus controls all of this. Remember, that's kind of like the governor here. And the hypothalamus then communicates downstream from the brain down to the thyroid, or from the brain down to the ovaries, through these axes. And those are called the HPT, the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid axis, or the HPO, the hypothalamus pituitary ovary axis. And this process is constantly happening throughout the day. So I know that it can be confusing when you're looking at your labs, and a lot of times this trips people up because it's like, wait, is my thyroid high functioning or low functioning? Because my TSH is high. Remember, higher TSH means that the brain is sending more communication down the thyroid, and in turn, you've probably got lower thyroid hormone levels happening. Okay. So all in all, remember that low thyroid function can only be identified by free T3. That's really the most accurate way to understand what is going on within your thyroid. It's not commonly tested. And when that's happening, it's a protective mechanism by the body. It's our body saying we're protecting you from danger, from cell danger. And so we have to ask the bigger question of, why is the body protecting us? What is the body protecting us from? Is it a nutritional stress? Is it a nervous system stress? Is it a gut stress, a liver stress? What is causing this protective mechanism to happen? Okay. So if you are suspecting you have thyroid issues, any of these speed processes are being impacted, then I, don't just recommend getting a thyroid panel, but, that's a great place to start. But if any of those do come back out of range, or that you have, say, hypothyroidism, Hashimoto, something like that, then you're probably going to want to do additional testing alongside of that, because thyroid hormones really just tell you what are the hormone levels. They don't tell you why those hormone levels are out of range. And a lot of times we can conclude information based off of symptoms you're having. But sometimes there are deeper rooted things going on that you don't always have very clear symptoms that correlate with issues like mold or heavy metals, or dysbiosis like candida in the gut. Sometimes people have symptoms that are very clear and apparent, but sometimes they don't. I would say 60% of the time people don't have symptoms in these areas. And, it's not until we do the testing and we determine that that's actually what's going on, that we then have the answers we need to then be able to treat the root causes as to why that thyroid function is happening the way that it is. Okay. So, just basic thyroid panel, TSH is important, T4, T3, both the total and free levels of those. Reverse T3. Remember, if you're like in an acute state of illness, it might not be accurate. You might want to wait on getting it done until you're out of that. Testing all of those thyroid antibodies, especially TPO and TG antibodies, if you're suspecting there's any autoimmunity. If you have a genetic risk factor, you're more prone. If you already have an autoimmune disease, then you are also more prone to another autoimmune condition developing. Potentially also looking at things like cortisol, as well as C-reactive proteins. So you can see if inflammation and high cortisol are part of the high TSH and low free T3 picture. Sometimes it can be helpful to, all the time really, it can be helpful to do mineral testing, because, as I mentioned, these mineral deficiencies can both cause hypothyroidism and also block your ability to convert that T4 over to T3. So these are minerals like iron and calcium, magnesium, potassium, selenium, zinc, that can all be tested. And we can test those through your hair, through a hair tissue mineral analysis, or we can test most of them through red blood cells, through your blood. You can also test for things like urinary iodine excretion. Iodine is a really important hormone that is part of what makes thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are actually made directly off the iodine, and both low iodine as well as high iodine levels can cause hypothyroidism. So iodine really is like this Goldilocks nutrient, where we don't want too much, we want just enough for thyroid hormone activity. So testing for how much iodine is being excreted is the most accurate way to test for that. You can test for iodine levels in blood, but I will say that it's not as accurate. We want to see how much is being excreted, and we can only test through that through urine. So urine iodine testing is really helpful for this. If you also, like I said, have issues where you aren't converting that T4 over to T3 well, not only are minerals going to be really important for that process, but like I mentioned, a lot of this happens both in the liver and in the gut. So potentially looking at issues that may be causing some of this liver slow down. So is your body under a lot of toxicity that is causing this process to slow down? So could there be potential issues like mold illness or heavy metal toxicity or endocrine disrupting chemicals? Any of those are going to slow down the ability to convert those thyroid hormones in your liver. The gut is also really important because that 20% of the T4 getting converted over to T3 happens through the probiotics in your gut. So if we don't have enough beneficial bacteria in the gut, this process gets slowed down. So potentially looking at your gut microbiome can also be really important. Genetics also play into this, especially as we talk about the gut, or sorry, about the liver. The liver and the gut are interconnected. So it's not necessarily wrong to say the gut, but really as we talk about the liver, there is something that is called deiodination that you might have heard of before. And this is a really important process that's part of the whole thyroid hormone puzzle. And our genetics influence this. We have deiodinases, or what they're called, deiodinase 1, 2, and 3. And then we also have different genes as well, like CYP3A4, that's part of our liver metabolism that also regulates that ability to convert that T4 over to T3. But these deiodinase enzymes in particular, they're not something that are commonly tested, especially in the US, but they are something that can be really interesting to look at. And that's because they are actually what are produced in our cells that enable us to convert T4 into T3. And if you have a genetic mutation, so say that you like inherited a slow copy from your mom or your dad, especially in that deiodinase 2 gene, it can actually cause a deficiency of T3 within your cells, but your thyroid hormone function test will be normal. So again, going back to like why thyroid hormone panels weren't even something that were probably solidified, or that we know weren't solidified until the 1970s. So much of that is because they don't always tell us the full picture of what's going on in thyroid. And part of that is because of this deiodination. So if you're like, yeah, my thyroid panel actually looks normal, I don't have the low T4 to low T3 or low or out of range TSH, but I have all of the hypothyroid symptoms, it could actually be related to this deiodination issue. And people that are carriers of this gene, they also have a strong association with insulin resistance. So maybe testing your insulin levels could be a more helpful way to understand if this could be going on. If you are insulin resistant, you've got elevated insulin levels, and you have a lot of low thyroid function symptoms, and your thyroid panel looks normal, it could be a deiodination issue that's at play. And this is actually really common. About 12 to 36% of the population has this polymorphism. Polymorphism essentially is just a fancy term that means you have the genes that cause a slow or abnormal function of this deiodinase activity. So this is something that like I said, we don't often test for, but we can conclude by looking at some of your other hormone testing data alongside some of your symptoms. Other potential issues that may be at play is that you are having other labs that are out of range. Like maybe you've been working on your gut for several years or several months and it's not getting better. You still have a lot of bloating and you have a lot of constipation. It could be because your thyroid is actually at play. You have thyroid hormone receptors in your gut, and your thyroid hormones regulate the speed of how food moves through your digestive system. So again, there could be other values to look at that could be lending us information into what's going on within your deiodinase levels and ultimately within your thyroid hormones. And this is really important. Deiodination is the most important metabolic pathway of thyroid hormones. This process is how we make usable thyroid hormones. So we have to be thinking about what's going on here. And unfortunately, I just don't think that it's commonly talked about. And if you are able to get testing with your deiodinase levels, then what you're looking for is really patterns within this activity. So for example, if you have high deiodinase 1 levels, then generally you're going to have normal to high free T3 levels, but you're going to have low free T4 levels and low reverse T3 levels. On the other end, if you have high D2, deiodinase 2 activity, then you probably are going to have normal or low reverse T3 levels, but you might also have low free T4 levels. So the deiodonases directly correlate with your thyroid hormone activity. And so sometimes having this information about your deiodinase levels can be really valuable for us to glean a little bit more insight into what's going on within your thyroid hormones and how your body is using those thyroid hormones. So I know that this topic can be really confusing and your mind probably feels like it wants to burst. And you're like, why can't my endocrinologist or whoever's managing my thyroid, why can't they just explain this and figure it out and figure out how to manage things? And I hear you. I know that hormones in general can be really complex to understand. But I want to reassure you that you are the biggest advocate of your own health. And it is so important to try to do as much of your own education as possible, because the more that you understand these things, the more you can advocate for yourself, the more that you can feel in control and empowered by how to support your health and where you might need to go next if things aren't working for you. I also hope that this episode provides you as kind of like a tool or a rule book, a framework for how to read your thyroid hormone levels when you get them back, because unfortunately, I don't think a lot of practitioners have enough time with their patients to explain this. It can be really confusing to explain. And because of that, you really just need a resource for where you can turn to, where you can listen to this podcast multiple times so you can really grasp how all of this process is working, so that you can understand some of the nuances and intricacies of how our body makes thyroid hormones and why you might be having thyroid hormone issues, but it's not showing up on your labs and all of the things in between. So I just want to reassure you that if you are like Googling all the symptoms of low thyroid function and you're like, I check all of those, and you're not able to get this testing done, or you are getting it done and it's coming back normal, that there's more to explain. There's more that could be going on, and to not discount the symptoms that you're experiencing, because a standard thyroid hormone panel, one, isn't enough to really tell you anything. And even a full thyroid hormone panel, as we talked about, sometimes still isn't even an accurate way to really diagnose, determine a thyroid issue that's at play. So you are always your best health advocate. You know your body best. And I hope that this serves as a tool that you can always come back to in the future for understanding your thyroid hormone levels. We'll be back next week with a guest expert episode. I will see you guys then. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode.